since we're all kind of friends, I don't think we'll go around and have everybody give introductions. Unless you would like to introduce yourself, feel free to turn your light on. Maybe just by a show of hands, how many are new to the Rev and Tax Committee for this interim? Oh, wow. Okay, all right. We've got, we've got, you know what? I'm just gonna read the names for the thousands listening online that couldn't see the hands. Representative Elison, that other Joseph Elison, Representative Kyle, Representative Pitcher, Representative Thurston, and I think I've got everybody that's new. Okay. Sorry, nope. You have to run for another position to have that authority. So, anyway, welcome. Just know revenue tax is extremely interesting, and hopefully you selected this committee and weren't assigned it. It's just so. All right, we will. I'll look for a motion to approve the minutes of the November 16, 2022 meeting. Senator McKay makes a motion to approve those minutes. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Aye. Okay, all right. Chair rules that passes unanimously. All right, we are going to go to, and by the way, just for the existing members and the new committee members, we have really excellent staff for this committee. We're extremely fortunate, not to diminish the staff on any of their committees, but we have very good staff, so we're grateful for that. We will go to Andrea Valenti Arthur to give us a recap from the 2023 general session about some of the bills that, select summary of the bills that we passed last session. Andrea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Valenti Arthur. I'm an attorney with the Office of Legislative Research and General Counsel. Is that better? Yes. Okay. And I am staff for this committee. In your meeting materials, there is a document that has summaries of the 80 or so tax bills that the legislature considered during the 2023 general session. The chairs have asked me to highlight just a handful of past bills. And I'm going to talk about 3 bills that affect income tax and sales tax, or 2 bills that affect income tax and sales tax, and 3 bills that affect property tax. And the first one I wanted to overview is HB 54, tax revisions. This is one that you probably have heard quite a bit about. It was the main tax package from the 2023 general session, and it made 5 changes, 4 relating to income tax and 1 relating to sales tax. The first income tax change was that it lowered the individual and corporate tax rates from 4.85% down to 4.65%. These income tax changes are effective for the 2023 tax year. The second change was to modify the taxpayer tax credit, specifically the dependent portion of that tax credit. There's a credit available for dependents. This bill added an additional dependent credit for the year of a dependent's birth. The third change was to extend eligibility for the Social Security tax credit by increasing the threshold by which under which you could claim all of your Social Security tax credit taxes as a credit. As an example, for married filing jointly, that threshold went up from $62,000 to $75,000, and then it starts phasing out. The fourth income tax change was to modify eligibility for the earned income tax. Under that change, you have to earn W-2 income in Utah, but in exchange, the tax credit amount was increased from 15% of the federal tax credit to 20% of the tax credit. The final change relates to sales tax, and it will remove the state portion of the sales and use tax on groceries in 2025, contingent upon the passage of SJR 10, which is a constitutional amendment, which is the second bill I wanted to talk about. SJR 10 is a proposal to amend the Utah Constitution relating to the income tax. Specifically, it modifies the earmark in the Constitution for uses of income tax revenue. Right now, there's only 4 authorized uses for income tax revenue, and if SJR 10 is approved by voters, it would authorize the use of income tax revenue for any state need after fulfilling public education funding requirements that are laid out in SJR 10. and bolstered by another bill, HB 394, which relates to providing some additional funding to schools for the next 5 to 10 years in the event of enrollment declines. The third bill I wanted to talk about was SB 34, Water Infrastructure Funding Study. This bill created a requirement for the Department of Natural Resources, along with experts and stakeholders, to study the use of property tax revenue to fund water infrastructure treatment and delivery. Specifically, that study group is going to compare Utah's funding sources to other states, analyze the actual use of that property tax revenue for everything from infrastructure to operation, and to investigate the use of water user fees to improve equity among water users and promote water conservation. The recommendations from that study group will be presented to this committee and to the Natural Resources Committee toward the end of next interim. The fourth bill is SB 81, Property Tax Deferral Revisions. This bill modifies a process that was put into place during the 2022 session relating to deferrals on taxes for homes of individuals who are 75 years or older. This bill was more of a refining of that process and outlined the circumstances under which the county has to offer a deferral. It also clarifies when property tax or deferred property taxes are due, including making explicit that a surviving spouse can continue the deferral. It provides logistics for securing payment on the deferred property taxes, and it establishes penalties for providing false information in an application for a deferral or other types of property tax relief. And then the final bill that I'm going to highlight is HB 231, Low Income Property Tax Exemption. This bill provides that permanent supportive housing facilities are eligible for the exclusive use property tax exemption if 3 conditions are met. First, the property has to be owned jointly by a nonprofit entity and a for-profit entity in a low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC arrangement. Second, the property has to be intended to be transferred back to the nonprofit entity at the end of the LIHTC period. And finally, the property units have to be rented exclusively to tenants who are homeless. So that's just a few of the past bills from last session. If you do have questions about the other 75 or so bills, feel free to reach out to me after the meeting. I'm be happy to talk through those with you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Appreciate that. Oh, yes, sorry. Representative Lyman.
Is there a summary of those bills? That very last one that you were talking about is kind of piqued my interest, and is that on the agenda, something we look at to find that, or?
So it is in the summary document that is in the meeting materials under HB 231.
Okay, I'll just check into that. Might ask you some questions about it.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item number 3, interim study item list. We're going to review and potentially amend and adopt, hopefully, the proposed list of interim study items. The committee may also open or authorize the chairs to open committee bills related to interim study items. We will turn it over to Chris from our staff to go over the list as it currently stands. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chris Stitt, Policy Analyst, Legislative Research and General Counsel. The chairs of the Revenue and Taxation Interim Committee created this list of interim study items with input from legislators, the State Tax Commission, and committee staff. This list was approved in April by the Legislative Management Committee and will guide the committee work over the interim. Legislative Rule JR 71401 requires this committee to adopt a list of interim study items during the interim committee's first meeting of the calendar year. The committee may, by majority vote, modify or add to the list of study items, and by majority vote, adopt this study item list. The study item list, as approved by LMC, is on the meeting material list online. As you can see, the majority of the items are our major tax pillars: income tax, sales and use tax, property tax, and other tax issues. Within those, we have varying items that we'll be going over at the interim. If you have any specific questions regarding these items, feel free to reach out to staff.
All right, thank you, Chris. We'll now move, well, I'll look for a motion to approve the list or make any modifications. Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to look at adding a couple items.
That's in order.
Thank you very much. The first one I'd like to look at adding is, there's been a constituent of mine that works in county government up there. I'd like to discuss and propose some additional ways to improve on the truth in taxation notices and the notice process. There are a couple ways we can add clarity and transparency for taxpayers and reduce some confusion that's occurred. The goal would be to provide taxpayers with simple additional information regarding the taxing entity's proposed budget. So I would love to add that as an item and have some discussions on what we can do to improve truth in taxation with notices sent out to taxpayers.
Okay. Is that a motion?
That would be a motion.
I thought I heard a motion
Yes,
there. I just
yeah,
wanted to
there's an
clarify.
echo, so.
So, okay, all right. Those in favor of adding further clarification to the truth and taxation notice, adding it to the interim study list, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, chair rules that passes unanimously. Did you have another item?
Yeah, just one other item of discussion. It's come to my attention that there's been an issue with individuals who have been purchasing high-priced motorhomes, boats, vehicles that have been registering them in Montana. I think it's costing the state millions of dollars in sales tax. Not that I have something that we can, I think maybe we can discuss it. I don't have a solution to the problem, but I think it's a problem, and maybe if nothing else, we can maybe educate people that that is actually illegal and a fraud to do that. But I know it's a real problem that I've been made aware of from the Tax Commission and others, that I think people are maybe unaware that it is against our statute to go to Montana to buy a vehicle and avoid sales tax and then drive that vehicle here in Utah. I just think it's something that I'd love to have some, maybe some testimony on just how serious a problem it is. Not so sure that there's a solution yet, but just to maybe make people aware that it's a huge problem.
Yes, okay, thank you. Any discussion to that motion? All right. Those in favor of adding the item related to registering recreational vehicles outside the state of Utah to avoid paying property tax in Utah.
Sales tax.
Excuse me, sales tax
Well, I mean-
and potentially property
Yeah,
tax.
exactly. You're correct.
Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, chair rules that passes, and that's been added to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, you're welcome, and we'll now go to Representative Judkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted some clarity on this study list and also on bringing bills to the committee to look at. Does this limit if someone has a bill file that has to do with taxes that they would like to come and talk with the committee about, but it doesn't necessarily fall under one of these, does it limit it so that we cannot bring that?
That's a very good question. Absolutely not. Nope. If there's obviously bills that are just opened individually and are assigned to our committee, we're happy to hear. And even if sometimes there's a bill that even if our committee doesn't have to pass it, maybe it's an appropriation bill that's heard in a different committee, but it could relate. I think the chairs would even be open to entertaining that if it's germane. So,
Okay.
yeah, Senator McKay.
I would just add, Representative Judkins, the items that we signed up for study are things that we know that the Ribbon Tax Committee's been working on for a while, trying to, land on some things or sort out some things that didn't finish last year. But it by no means, as Senator Wilson has shown, it's not the end of all study. And so I know myself, my philosophy has been, if you're on the committee, we have the right to, bring things forward for us to study it. And so let's do it. So we're happy to
Thank you,
help.
I appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Brammer.
Yeah, I was
I'd like to move to add an item to the study, and the study item would be lease revenue bonds. And just for context, lease revenue bond, typically when an entity goes out for bonding, they have to seek approval from the voters through and get that approval. But when they do a lease revenue bond, they get around that voter approval, and it ends up being that they just pay a higher rate, and it's not part of our typical bonding process. And what's ended up happening in certain circumstances is an entity will go to the voters for approval. It will be denied by the voters, and then instead of abiding by that, they go out and just get lease revenue bonds and pay more money than what the voters were unwilling to approve in the first place. And it can be complicated because there are circumstances where it's probably appropriate and others where it's not. But it's something that we probably need to look at because it's becoming a tool that is more frequently used. And the way that it's set up is essentially the entity will set up an alter ego entity and lease from itself, and that funds the bond. And so that's how they get around our typical bonding requirements.
Okay, thank you, Representative Thurston. Did you want to speak to this? Okay. All right, so those in favor of adding the item to interim study as described by Representative Brammer relating to creative lease financing as they go around for traditional bonding, did I summarize that correctly? Say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Representative Provo is joining us online in case you're wondering who that voice is that's just appearing, so. Okay, that item is added to the list. Representative Thurston.
Yeah, I move that we add one more small item to the list. Did the legislature intend to tax snow dogs the same as snowmobiles?
Sorry, will you clarify, expand on that, please?
So we have a tax registration, property tax on snowmobiles. And then what we don't have one, for example, on lawnmowers and riding lawnmowers, other things like that. There's a new type of vehicle, if you will, or a tool called a snow dog, which is not really a snowmobile, but it's not really not a snowmobile. Under the statute, it meets the legal definition of snowmobile, so it's being taxed as if it's a snowmobile. And the question was to study whether that was actually our intent to start taxing things like that or not. I don't have a preconceived idea of whether we should or shouldn't, but I think we should take a look at that and see if that was something that we want to do or want to not do.
So you're not referring to like a Siberian Husky or St. Bernard? This
No.
is different, okay.
Yeah, it's a type of a device that has a motor and a track on it, but it's used to pull things like a dog would be. It's basically a motorized Siberian.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Senator McKay just pulled up a picture of it, so I had never seen that before. Interesting.
go.
Learned something new today. So, okay. All right. Those in favor of adding that item relating to snow dogs to the list, interim study list, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Chair rules that passes unanimously. Okay. All right. That Senator McKay.
Thanks. I'd like to make a motion that we grant the chairs the authority to open related bill files or open bill files related to committee study items and keep those bill files, and with the requirement that the chairs bring the issues to every interim committee and keep everybody updated on the status of what bills are opened and the purposes are related to it. So for transparency purposes, likely include it on the agenda so that people can view it and see it that way. But it would give the chairs the ability to open a bill file. This is most frequently actually used by committee members in the past, where they call us and want to start working on something, and instead of waiting for interim, we are then able to facilitate the opening of a committee bill file for the purpose of our process. So that is the motion.
Okay. Thank you. That's in order. I see a couple lights. Representative Thurston.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. So is the motion to allow the chairs to open up any bill file or just things related to our study items?
I heard him say items related to interim study items. Is that
Okay.
correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would that be both chairs would have to agree or just one of them?
Both have to
Both,
agree.
which is in
Okay.
joint rule.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that is in joint rule, requires both chairs to consent, so yeah.
And they are also public bill files, just for the record.
Yep.
So, okay, thank you. Motion's before us to allow the chairs to open up, jointly open up bill files related to interim study items. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, great, that passes also, thank you. All right, that looks like it does it for lights, unless this is your last chance. Okay. Okay, all right, so.
It's your last chance unless you come to the chairs and want to, consider it and we can work on bills.
Correct. So I will entertain a motion to approve the items on the revised study list.
So moved.
Senator McKay makes the motion to approve the items on the original list and those that we have just added. All those in favor of that motion say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, chair rules, that passes unanimously. Okay, all right. Wow, we're almost halfway through our agenda. We're really efficient today, so. Okay, we'll now move to item number 4, economic and revenue update. This will be an update, a presentation on the state of the Utah economy and state tax revenues. We like to welcome Phil Dean, Chief Economist from the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute, and Legislative Fiscal Analyst staff, Travis Eisenbacher. Did I say that correctly? Okay, I'll be turning your microphones on there, so, okay, great, and Budisha Mudhari. Did I get close?
Yes.
Okay, great. I have a difficult last name, so I'm very sensitive to pronunciation, even though my feelings aren't easily hurt, so. Okay, welcome, and the time is yours.
Well, thank you, and trying to, not sure why I'm not getting full screen here, but we'll try again. All right, there we go. So I'm Phil Dean. I'm with the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute, and I'm here to talk a little bit about Utah's revenue portfolio, looking at that some over time, provide some high-level context, and then colleagues at the Legislative Fiscal Analyst will follow up talking about current revenue collections, current economic conditions, and so forth. One of the things from a public finance standpoint is very common to think of different revenues as a portfolio. So think of your maybe retirement fund, a 401k fund or something like that. You could think of each revenue stream being similar to a different type of stock. Some are more stable, some are more volatile. So I'm just going to work through a couple of the state and local government in Utah's main pieces of the tax portfolio. So this is a really long-term time series looking at the tax portfolio for Utah. Going back over 100 years. So if you look back, property tax used to be the tax imposed in Utah, including by the state. Then the Great Depression hits, and we get income taxes and sales taxes that come on board. A little bit earlier than that, we had fuel taxes come on board, and then excise taxes such as cigarette tax or something like that. And then shown there in the orange is the corporate income tax. So I show this just to give a little bit of context as you think about the overall state and local tax structure in the state. 3 major taxes make up roughly 90% of all tax revenue collected within Utah. The property tax, which is a local tax, but does interact a fair bit with school funding that you approve in the state budget. Sales taxes that are imposed at the local level as well as at the state level. And then income taxes, which are only a state-imposed tax. The other piece I just want to highlight here is, because it relates to some of the public finance challenges I think the state and local governments have to grapple with. Look at that motor fuel tax piece back many decades ago. That was a much larger share of the revenue portfolio. And over time, as we'll see here in a minute, the gas tax essentially has not paced with our economic growth and demands on our transportation infrastructure. And so the gas tax now makes up a much smaller share than it used to historically, which has created some different challenges to kind of work through. So this is another one from a publication we actually just recently put out in April. It's one that your members of your staff have copies of that focuses on the individual income tax, but tries to put that in context of the entire state tax portfolio. So that's the income tax there. I'll maybe start with that, highlighted in red. The income tax grows well, but also is very volatile. And you're experiencing that volatility with the revenue report I saw come out yesterday. Similar with corporate income tax, it's even more volatile than the individual income tax. Motor fuel tax and property tax are very stable taxes. They also don't grow as rapidly overall. And then the one I want to highlight is the state sales and use tax there in the yellow, and local sales and use taxes. And that's actually where we've seen a very large amount of the growth is in local sales and use taxes. That the state sales tax rate has actually been fairly consistent over time. But many of these local sales taxes are directly related to, they're earmarked for transportation purposes, both for roads and for transit. So again, if you adjust for inflation and population growth, you look back over this 50-year time period that we're looking at here, from 1972 to 2022, that's declined. The gas tax, and this also includes registration fees, have declined. And so what's happened over time is we've gone from a fairly heavy user fee mode of paying for transportation to a much more general tax-focused way of paying for transportation, primarily through the sales tax. Then transitioning to look at the income tax again, here's just breaking out the individual and corporate income tax, again, on an inflation-adjusted basis. Solid growth that takes place there. Of the major taxes, the fastest growing tax. Again, the detail and I think some useful historic context is in the report we provided. But this looks at the income tax base. We actually have an income tax base that's very well aligned with the economy. In fact, in the recent decade or so, it's actually grown faster than the economy's grown. This one shows the income tax rate. So we used to have a bracketed system in Utah through 2008, and now we have a single tax rate. One thing I like to point out in this is the peak individual income tax rate that we had in the state was 7.75%, that it increased to that in 1975. And since that time, the income tax rate has stayed flat or declined. And with the changes this session that, as was mentioned before, we're at a 4.65 individual income tax rate. This now just highlights those three major taxes and hopefully illustrates that individual income tax is the most volatile of the major taxes. Property tax the most stable, and then sales tax kind of in between those two. As you're all aware and voted on this last session, the Utah Constitution limits the use of income tax. For a long time, from the 1940s through the mid-90s, that was for K-12 education only, and then it was broadened to include higher education as well as K-12 education. And then there was a 2020 constitutional amendment that passed that broadened that further to include people with disabilities and other services for children. And then there's the ballot proposition that will be on the ballot next year. So transitioning to property tax, again, a local tax, but that heavily interrelates with the state budget through the K-12 funding system, that it does grow, but over this long-term horizon, especially over the last decade, but it grows much slower than these other taxes. The tax base, what is being taxed? Yes?
We have a question from Senator Fillmore.
On your chart that showed the uses of income tax dollars, one might look at that and think, wow, education funding has gone down. And I suppose it's gone down as a percentage of the total income tax pie.
Yep.
I wonder if, it doesn't appear you have a slide that answers this question, but I wonder if you know, how does that compare with the actual funding of public education over that same period?
Yeah, and I don't have it over the entire time period, but over the last, let's say, decade, there have been some very significant increases on an inflation-adjusted basis in state funding. I think that's a really good point to raise. If you look, we may have a piece of this in the income tax report, but in the property tax report, I can get you that slide that does show very significant increases in K-12 funding.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just really quick, maybe you covered this back in 1931 when they had the income tax. What was the gray, what's the box gray area? I
yeah.
thought it all went to public education.
So it did after the kind of late 1940s when the minimum school program was established. In conjunction with that, there's a constitutional change that fully earmarked it. Initially, it was 75% was allocated for K-12 and 25% went into the state general fund. So the state was still imposing a property tax for state purposes at that point.
Yeah, because I've been saying that everything went to education, but obviously it didn't. from
Yeah,
the
for a
original.
long time it
Okay.
did, but not the entire.
Interesting.
Yep,
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, proceed.
thanks. Again, with the property tax, this is looking at taxable property, not the revenues, but it paces quite well. There's some variation over time, but it paces quite well with the economy. This is one that's been a subject of discussion in the last couple of years, that the composition of that distribution of the tax burden among taxpayers has increased over time for a number of different reasons. Especially under the way the truth in taxation system works here in Utah. Values essentially redistribute or allocate that burden among different classes of taxpayers. And we'll have the 2022 data here in another couple months, as I understand, that can provide another update to that. The majority of property taxes go to pay for schools. A little under 60% of property taxes fund schools in the state. The rest among cities and towns, counties, and then limited purpose districts. I'm sure you all know this, but a lot of people, when you talk to them, they think they're paying all this money to the county, and the county is imposing all those taxes, when really that's distributed among the taxing entities. And then just looking at sales tax to wrap up here. Again, looking at the long-term growth, separating out the state sales tax and the local sales tax. The one thing I do want to highlight on the local sales tax, the general 1% local sales tax has been constant, that rate, since 1980, I want to say 83, 84, for quite a long time. It's been very consistent. The growth that you've seen over that time largely relates to other local earmarked sales taxes. And then you do see the increases in recent years in the state sales tax, not necessarily from a rate, except for the voter initiative that increased the sales tax rate for Medicaid. But also you start seeing in the last couple of years of that, remote sales increase that level of collections of sales tax. And then just to finish up, this just shows the sales tax base, so taxable sales, going back to when the sales tax was first imposed as a percentage of personal income, this broad measure of the economy. It's historically been on this downward trend, and again, maybe going back to a point Representative Elison raised before, this doesn't mean sales tax revenues are declining. This is saying as a share of the economy, that has historically declined long term. And again, you do see over the last couple years, however, that uptick, some of which relates to remote sales collections, and some of it relates, I'm assuming, to federal fiscal stimulus and the economic impacts of that as people bought a lot over the last couple years.
I have a question from Representative Judkins.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I don't know what it means when you're saying this is the sales tax base as percent of personal income, or this is the property tax base as percent of personal income. I don't understand what you mean as a percent of personal income.
Yeah, so you take personal income's one measure, and the reason I use personal income here, the data is a lot more accessible going back. You can also do it to gross domestic product or GDP, but they're both considered to be these fairly broad measures of the economy. GDP is a broader measure than personal income, but
So
it's
I know what GDP is. Explain
Yep.
it to me as if I'm in third grade, what you mean by personal income, what's
Yeah.
all added together
Yeah, so
to
personal
create that?
income, just think of all the households in the state
Right.
and the income that they receive.
So when you say that the property taxes as a percent of personal income, you have like 200%. How could property tax be?
Not, yeah, so this is gonna be the tax base, not tax revenues. So this is, you think about total property values in the state, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. And you're taxing that at, a 1-ish%, let's say, tax rate. So it's not the revenues, it's the base, it's the economic base that the
That we're
tax is
pulling
being
taxes
imposed on.
from.
Yes,
Thank
not
you.
the actual revenues.
Okay.
Yep, great clarification there.
Okay, thank you. And Representative Thurston.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So one of the things that I've been kind of curious over the last 10 years or so, even before I was here, there's a lot of consumption that we don't tax. Part of that got resolved with Wayfair, it's like out-of-state purchases and online and stuff like that. Have you looked at all about some of the other things that people who live in Utah buy, but we don't get to tax?
So that's largely what this is showing. Over the time period that you see this decline as a share of the total again, you see very much a growth in the service producing sector of the economy. We do tax some services, but many services are excluded from the tax base. We by and large tax most goods. And so, what you're seeing is significant portions of service consumption are not included in the tax base, where the majority of goods consumption is included in the tax base.
And that would include out-of-state services especially, such as travel, which is kind of a new thing with Gen Z, right? They want the experience, and so they'll spend thousands of dollars on a trip to Bali, and we get zero tax from that experience.
Yeah, and there are certainly those that come to the state, there are taxes imposed on that. They're purchasing things here at the sales tax or staying in a hotel. So we are capturing a portion of that, of those who come here, but probably not fully capturing that tax that potentially we could export. And then on the other side, Utahns that go elsewhere because they want an experience somewhere else. Certainly we're not capturing the economic value of that in the tax base.
Okay, great, thank you.
Representative Lyman.
Thank you. I guess just talking about personal income, and are we taking the position that sales tax should stay at a certain percentage of personal income?
No, I'm not making an argument one way or not on that. It's just making this comparison to the economy. And I do think it relates, here at the state level, sales tax goes into the general fund, by far the biggest revenue source of the general fund. Income tax has these constitutional constraints on it. And so I do think it speaks to that issue, but I'm certainly not advocating one way or another that it should capture any particular percentage of the economy.
It seems like to me as well, personal income has gone up, and then it's also in different pockets. In some areas, you'll see personal income that's gone way up, and other areas that you see personal income really hasn't gone up that much. You got people, billionaires that are factored into this as well, and they've got lots and lots of personal income. We've seen some mega wealthy people in Utah, and that tends to tip the scale. And I guess I'm concerned that it might be a false flag of maybe that legislature isn't doing enough to capture that in sales tax base, when in reality, the average person in Utah, I'm not sure that that's the case. I think the average person in Utah probably is, paying as much in sales tax. And by average, I mean somebody who's not in that upper tier.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just follow up on that
Yeah,
point.
please.
I think that's right, you think about the distribution of the income tax and the distribution of the sales tax among taxpayers, they're very different, where the income tax is, there's a much higher proportion of that is borne by higher income households, and the sales tax, a much higher proportion of that is borne by lower or middle income households. Yeah, and it's just, I want to go back to this one too, because I think it speaks at least somewhat, maybe not fully, but partially to what you're talking about, that this is showing inflation-adjusted per capita change in the state sales tax. So if you look at the state sales tax, especially that hasn't had the dramatic rate increases like you've seen at the local level, like that kind of captures, maybe imperfectly, but at least somewhat captures, I think, your point about growth in the economy.
Okay. I guess, Chair, I'm just trying to anticipate what some of the conclusions are that, because I don't think you're drawing really conclusions here, you're just presenting data.
Yep.
So I'm anticipating what some of the conclusions might be from observing the data. Thanks.
Yep, and if that, sorry, were there other questions? I was just going to say, again, I'm not here advocating for anything, just providing information. And I do want to make you aware that there are copies of the individual income tax report. We have copies of those. That recent one for all members of the committee, that your staff should have those. And then we brought, these other ones have been released in prior years. We brought a few extra copies that you can get with the staff to get. And I just do want to conclude with this point, maybe following up on yours, Representative, of, you know, a lot of times it's really easy to focus on the rate, and that's certainly an important part of it, but also pay attention to the base, right? Is the base at the level that you want that tax base to be? Because that often gets lost in conversations.
Yeah, thanks.
Senator McKay.
So just so everyone knows, they're passing out the charts for, you know, for your personal consumption for the future. I've often thought that its size should be renamed to a visual but inconvenient guide to carry around for tax modernization. But aside from its inconvenience, this is a ready reference that I frequently refer to, and I really appreciate you know, Phil for presenting this information. I mean, clearly tracking trends in tax data is very valuable for us to keep our eyes on. It is easy when we're dealing with a specific bill or a specific issue to get lost in the forest and not really be able to see the forest through the trees. And I really like these types of presentations in the beginning of our conversations as we start to dig into the trees to get some perspective on where things are.
Staff has notified me that this is actually a violation of the Paperwork Reduction Act, so we're going to have to collect them back. I'm just kidding, just kidding. Okay, Senator Fillmore, did you have a question? What's that? No? Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. That looks like that answers the questions for now.
I guess that's permanently attached.
It's all right. Get it. All right, so moving forward. See what this comes up with. That's right, thank you. All right, so my name is Travis Eisenbacher, economist with Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office.
If you could pull that microphone just a little bit closer. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Bidu Samudpuri. I'm also one of the economists with the Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office. We'll be presenting an economic and revenue update to y'all today. And so starting right off with our biggest indicator, which is inflation. Overall, we have a decline. The black line you see is the all-item inflation. We had our peak inflation around last summer, and we can see that it's going down. As of our April data, we are at 4.9% of inflation. So these indicators are updated as soon as we get the data. The other thing we wanted to point out is the all-item, less food and energy, is also kind of declining. The one area where we see inflation still high up is the service-less energy services, line, and that's also probably because during the pandemic, a lot of people, going back to Phil's point about how during quarantine, people were using, like, buying more goods than services, and now with everything opening up, people are going back to getting those experiences and services, and we can see that in our inflation data. Just a quick point that just because the market is starting to correct itself and come back to somewhat of a natural growth rate, we should also adjust our expectation for, like, sales and use taxes going forward. Going to the next slide, this is another further breakdown of other categories within inflation. The black line represents a gasoline, which is the most volatile line. During summer months, overall, we always have a higher gas prices, so as we're going into the summer of this year, we will be keeping a close observation of what would happen there. We do see a disinflation in food prices, though still elevated, and shelter continues to trend upwards. The shelter line would be like the purple line, and the food would be the green, and they're still teetering a little bit upwards. The next slide is the consumer inflation expectation. So both of our I want to do this and the next one. So consumer inflation expectation, and the next slide is the market inflation expectation. Seems like both consumer and the market, they're both expecting inflation to be a little bit lower than what we have right now, however, not to the levels that we had before pandemic era. So one of the reasons why we look into the expectation of inflation is because inflation gets reflected in prices. The inflation expectation ends up reflecting in prices, but seeing that both consumer and market are not expecting inflation to go down before the pandemic era is actually a good indicator. Moving on to our next indicator, which is the labor market update. I have both US and the Utah's unemployment data. The black line is the US unemployment data, while the red represents the Utah. Unemployment nationwide currently is at 3.4%, but Utah stands at 2.4%. A quick note I would like to make is the national data is all the way up to April of 2023. However, Utah's data is only up to March 23. It's just how when we did this presentation, it's when the data started flooding in. So, but yeah, so we still have a lower unemployment rate than the national average. The next slide shows the employment rate in Utah. We can see that the trend that started last summer, which was upward growth, is still continuing. And we expect that to be that way. We actually are at higher level than we were before pandemic started, so pretty good growth rate. I don't want to spend a lot of time here. This was just more or so to say that Department of Workforce Services has this great interactive resource available to everyone with all the county breakdown, all the jobs created within US, state of Utah, and the counties. This was more of like FYI, there's this great resource for everyone that's available. But it seems like if we just look at March 22 versus March 23, there were almost like 40,000 jobs more created within Utah. So the next item I have is the consumer sentiments. So the consumer survey sentiments is based on data measuring residents' view of present economic situation and their expectation of the economy. We are definitely doing better than what the national is. So Utah's consumer, they reported they have 70.5 on their index when it comes to their outlook and their expectation, which is again above the national average. So this is the real personal income less transfer. When we say less transfer, these are we're excluding items such as Social Security, Medicaid, unemployment assistance, and so on. We see a growth in real personal income as well. So again, levels that are better than before the pandemic started. And then this is the yes.
We have at least one question. Representative Judkins, go ahead.
Thank you. Is now the time? I can wait till after? Or?
I think they love being interrupted.
Perfect. You guys could be auctioneers. I'm like, trying to keep up with what you're saying. You're
Yes.
very smart. Thank you for being here. So on this real personal income, less transfers, when you talk about real personal income, this is not my wheelhouse, so sorry. I actually have probably 40,000 questions I could ask, but I'll just ask this one. When you talk about real personal income, is that just a dollar amount, or is it indexed to anything like, because I think people are earning more money, but they're also paying far more out to food and housing and transportation, and so maybe this, so is this increase in real personal income, does it show that they're really not maybe doing better, or are they doing better overall?
Actually, they are. Thank you for this question, because I did have a quick note about the inflation adjustment on this chart that I seem to have forgot to mention. But yes, so looking at the March numbers, it seems like even though the chart says it rose by 6.3% year over year, however, when adjusted to inflation using the price index and the real personal income, it seems like the year-over-year increase was 2.1%. So we still see an increase in personal income. It's just when we adjust it to the inflation, it does lower it to 2.1, but it's still an overall growth from 0.3% to 2.1% year-over-year. Yes, thank you. So the next slide is the consumption expenditure. Again, we're seeing people are again spending more, but again making the point to the inflation and everything costing more. We do see that people are spending more now than even before the pandemic hit, and that's also a good indicator of a strong economic growth. So the last, or on the same consumer spending, one thing, again, a reiterating theme is people have switched from goods to services. So if you look to the bar graph, we can see that during the first quarter of 2023, our goods actually has gone down. This consumer spending within goods has gone down, but services has gone up. Some of the areas where we're seeing higher expenditure in the first quarter of 2023 is housing, utilities, healthcare, food services, accommodation, and other services. I think it's just like during quarantine, everybody was so cooped up. Now they just want to go out and, spend in services, restaurants, travel, and other experiences. The last thing within the consumer chart is the gas prices. The red line represents the Rocky Mountain, and the black line represents the gasoline prices within the U.S. Naturally, we have the Rocky Mountain region has always been a little bit higher than the national average, but as of May 23, we're seeing kind of like neck to neck. And this is also because of like the refineries we have and also the general topography we have within the Rocky Mountain region, making the operational cost to be higher than the rest of the U.S. But we are about neck to neck right now with the national average. So the next update I have for everyone is the housing market update. This is just the case in Shiller's index. This tracks the change in value of single price houses within the U.S. We do see an overall growth in housing prices. The little bit of lowering we see in the beginning of this year is probably because of seasonality and plus the higher interest rate we have right now, but nothing too drastic is what we see. Again, this also shows the blue line represents the prices increase from January 21 to 2022, and the red is from January 2022 to 23. We still see a growth. I mean, it's not as drastic as we experienced during that 21 and 22 years, but it's still overall growth. We're not seeing any like negative on the negative side. So, Mr. Chairs.
Sorry, I was so enthralled in the graph that I sleep into the switch here. Representative Judkins.
Thank you. So it looks to me like most of this is national data,
Yes,
right?
yes. We will come back. We have the Utah's breakdown at the end of this
I
presentation.
will be quiet. Thank you.
Proceed, thanks.
Thank you. So then I had this data I found to be quite interesting. This was within the Salt Lake City market. It seems like an average median days that a house sits in a market is actually decreasing, which is actually a really good sign. At the peak of like around January of this year, a house would sit in a market for about average of 72 days, and now it's at 42 days as of April. So it shows that we do have somewhat of a higher demand for houses within Salt Lake City. And then a quick business update. So manufacturing and trade sales, so like shows how much within the US, again, this is another national data. And again, we're seeing growth. This tracks like wholesale trade. This data comes from like monthly retail trade surveys, wholesale trade surveys, and manufacturing shipments and inventories survey. So we do see a growth within that as well. The last thing I have, I don't think this is the last thing, is I do want to say that we did see a growth within the Q1 of 2023. The GDP did rise. It might not be as drastic as we would like, but it is still at 5.1% at annual rate within the first quarter. And then now I switch over to Travis.
Thanks, Medusa. Yeah, so for the sort of closeout of this presentation, I wanted to kind of dovetail on a lot of the things that Phil talked about, but maybe not quite as broad strokes looking back to the last century, but just more so in the more recent past. So highlighting some of these major events that we've experienced in collections. You can see on this chart here, this is going to go back to fiscal year 2018. We can see here the lower three lines there, those are going to be 18, 19, and the first part of 20, fairly tightly clustered there. This would be, quote, normal pre-pandemic sort of expectations, how we would see the year play out. And then we see that we've experienced much higher volatility in the years since, and this has really resulted from a lot of these unusual circumstances that we've experienced over the last few years with the pandemic and all of the various responses to this. One of the biggest factors here, in particular with collections, has been these timing changes that have happened with filing deadlines. So kind of just running through these quickly, as I mentioned, 20 was held down. Normally, you see there's that spike in the gray shaded area there. That's going to be the April collections when all of those individual filers' payments come in. That year, it was shifted out into July of the following year. And so we see in 21, that's going to be that sort of brown line in the middle, that was starting much higher than we would normally expect. And that was because of all those payments coming forward. And then later in that year, again, this was extended this time only through May, but the effect of that was to, again, change kind of the dynamic of how we see these collections come in through the year, shifting that big jump up from individual payments further out. And then the most recent, or the year previous to the current one, is that blue line where we see that large spike up in those final payments. This year did not have a significant filing deadline change, but really what we saw with that big boom there was related to the very strong rally we saw in the stock market and housing market the previous year. So there was a lot of non-wage income that was coming in those final payments collections in April. The most recent year, the one highlighted in red there, we see again there's this sort of unusual activity there in December and January. And so there was a policy change that was implemented with HB 444 or the 22 general session, and this allowed pass-through entities to file on behalf of their owners. Most of them file on a calendar year, so those payments came in December. The reason that they did this was for a slightly beneficial federal tax treatment. So normally those payments would have come in April with the individual filers. We saw those payments come in December. Of course, these are just sort of the policy changes that we've seen over the last few years. Obviously, there's been many things besides this that have been at play to make the last few years fairly unusual in both collections as well as the economy broadly, with so much federal action in response to the pandemic. We saw stimulus payments, federal funds coming in, suspension of various on foreclosures, student loan payments, and so on. So there were a lot of factors here, and the point of all this is really to say that it makes these year-over-year comparisons. So when you're looking at these numbers as we see them come in and we report them to you, it makes these a little difficult to make on a one-to-one, apples-to-apples sort of basis, and as well in our forecasts, it makes it slightly more difficult. So I'll just drill in, kind of again continuing this thread of going from the super high level into more specifics and with the more recent data that we have collected year to date. So this is just the general fund here. So we see this is much more stable and consistent both year to year and month to month than we saw in that overall picture. So this is primarily driven by sales tax. And really, there's not a whole lot of seasonality to sales tax in relation to the much more volatile income tax.
There is a bit of seasonal variation as people tend to change their spending habits throughout the year. Obviously, we have a big holiday boom, so we tend to see a spike up there in the December or the January collections, and that'll be on those December sales tax collections. And then also in the spring, typically, we have a lot of home improvement and landscaping activity, which again drives taxable sales goods that come in as collections here. And kind of to this point of volatility, the significance with this one is unlike the overall picture, with the variability, the year-over-year comps here do tend to work pretty well in terms of earlier in the year as an indication for where the year will end up. So just as like a generic example, if sales tax was up 5% in January, that's generally not a bad indication for where the year will end up. And we'll see later how that contrasts with the income tax. So this is just to further drill in then on just the sales tax component, which is the largest part of the general fund. So here on the left, we have the year-to-date collections for both last year as well as this year, currently year-to-date. And then on the right is a year-over-year growth chart. And so we see on the one on the left, we've tracked above the prior year consistently throughout the year into that point earlier, and with a consistent gap between the two lines, generally speaking. We see on the right there was that bit of a spike up there, and that's going to be that holiday bump that we saw this year with a pretty strong seasonal aspect to this. We see on the right, though, then after the holiday sales boom, collections have been softening consistently over time, and most recently, we're still in line with expectations, though, for the year on this one. So for the income tax fund, again, just to reiterate this, how different this chart looks, it's apparent to see this is much more volatile, variable, year to year and month to month throughout the year in terms of when we receive these payments. And so the seasonality is, of course, really around these filing deadlines. We see typically each year a small bump in October, and that's going to be related to extension filers payments coming in, as well as then in December and January when most corporate filers are going to be bringing in their payments. And then, of course, that large wave that comes in April, those are going to be the individual filers. And here to this point, the variability here is problematic in terms of making an assessment about how the year is going to end up based on, say, November's growth rate. As you can see, it's not consistent where if it's above at a point, it's really determined by that X factor being the final payments collections in April. And so drilling in on just the main component here, this is the individual income tax year to date on the left for both this year and last, and then the growth rate again on the right. So we see here, we started off the year fairly consistently above last year, and then there's this large deviation where we see the two coming apart there, and that's really going to be just that the SALT payments that came in, and we see on the right there that large spike up in the growth rate. So that's the year over year, highly sloped up there because of those payments coming in earlier. And then as we've passed that point in time when those payments would have otherwise come in, we see that those two lines have come back together, and most recently with the year-over-year softer or less significant final payments that have come in, that we've actually crossed over that line. And we see on the right the growth rate there that we've gone into the negative territory on this one. And then decomposing this further, just to continue on this thread of the volatility issues with this, we see in the gray line on the chart on the right, that's the year-over-year growth rate for just the withholding component of individual income tax. And so we see that almost, the vast majority of the variability is really the product of refunds, final payments, and then now this change with the SALT. So withholding itself is a much more stable component within individual income tax. And then I just wanted to kind of close out with some thoughts on the issues that this poses with seasonality and these unprecedented events for making those year-over-year comparisons, and the challenges that it poses from a forecasting perspective. So obviously the seasonality we can account for to a degree, but then when we have these one-off events like COVID and all of the responses to that, it does lend to forecast error or variance. And more specifically to this point on the individual income tax, with the deadline being beyond the scope of general session, that does introduce this sort of element of the April surprise where we don't necessarily have a great indication of how those payments are going to come in at the time when a lot of these decisions are being made. But then I would note also that the SALT payments that we get with this recent change, we see this as a good indication or a good way of coming up with a better indication for where the year will end up, with those payments being moved forward in the year and reducing the amount that we would get in that sort of surprise come April. And those were my comments on that.
Thank you. Go to few questions. Representative Lesser?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to have you comment on the 7-day rolling average year over year on that slide. Yeah. So tell me about the significance of that pretty significant drop and what that implication is for the future.
Yeah, so the point here was to that issue with the SALT payments. So last year, this was not a thing where the filers could, where the businesses could file on behalf of their owners. So those payments would have been filed by the individuals that, you know, were like owners of a pass-through entity. And those payments would have come in then in April. And so the year over year is comparing that big bulk of payments earlier in the year than they would have come in last year. And so it was shot up a whole bunch. And then as we passed that point in time, where last year they would have been paying in April, we've passed April. So now that big bump is being compared properly to when they would have already been paid last year.
Great. Thank you.
That looks like all the questions. I'm just going to ask, take the prerogative of the chair to ask a question. Good, I was waiting for Representative Spendlove. I was like, if anybody's going to have a question on this, it's got to be him, our resident economist.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like Representative Spendlove should make comments. Like,
I was just going to actually turn his light on and ask him to comment, but my question is, or it's just an observation. Given the kind of wind down of COVID funds, I was kind of surprised to see how strong our income tax collections were in comparison to last year, knowing that, you know, we had a big kind of sum of money working its way through the system. And is that a correct observation? Or, I mean, I thought maybe things would have dropped more in the current year.
I guess, so in relation to with like the stimulus payments that people received?
Yes, yeah.
I see. Yeah, so I think, you know, part of the story there is to do with, you know, the wage income component of that. Like with the holding specifically is going to be the wage income component of that. And with the growth that we've seen in wages, that's helped support that. So, you know, whereas maybe 2 years ago they would have got $1,000 bump from the stimulus payment, now they're making $1,000 more per year in their job. So I don't have like a specific thing that I could say like that's what's replaced that, but that's my sense of it.
That's actually pretty intuitive. So yeah, thank you. So
Could I follow
Yeah,
up on that question
sure.
as well?
Yeah.
I've done some work in this space, and it is kind of interesting. I'm certainly convinced the federal fiscal stimulus has not worked its way through the whole economy with all the multiplier effects. I think we probably have a year or two or more for that to run. As you look at household bank account balances, they were pretty consistently about $1 trillion for the decade prior to the pandemic. Since that time, they've grown, and they're up at around $5 trillion right now across the entire U.S. economy. I wish we had better Utah data specifically on that, but to me that represents a very large amount of spending capacity that's still sitting out there, and that's what creates uncertainty for me. Maybe households are just going to want to permanently hold higher balances and won't spend that, or maybe it gives them additional spending capacity that can still run its way through the system and then has multiplier effects that continue after that.
Alarm for 3:30.
So I think there's, like, my own sense, just as a sense of scale, if you look at the three major fiscal stimulus packages that were pandemic related, there have been other deficit spending increases since that time, but just those three pieces, those equal 25% of US GDP for that year. Now, those do hit, some of the ARPA money, it's still going out, so it didn't all hit the economy all at once. But just that massive amount of money in the economy, in my view, has not fully circulated, it hasn't run its course. Still more to go.
Yeah, thank you. I will, you mentioned, what, the 3 trillion in personal bank accounts? Or 5 trillion?
5, just under 5 right now.
Okay, an article just came out today, though, that said consumer debt passes 17 trillion for the first time despite slide in mortgage demand. So I guess we could say that we're maybe seeing a gross up of personal balance sheets of both cash and debt, but who knows? Okay, Representative Spendlove.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I want to thank the chairs for having this discussion. I think this is the most important rev and tax meeting of the year because we had the economists come in. And to Representative Lesser's point, and I'd love it if you guys could address this too, because we were just talking, we heard a similar presentation yesterday in the executive appropriations. And I was just talking to LFA and they made the point, one of the hardest parts for your job is trying to forecast this revenue and say, what does it mean, especially in the economic environment as tough as we're seeing right now. But they made the point to me with the chart on the right, that because we've pulled forward the revenue collections, it's going to actually make those forecasts a little bit easier. Can you kind of address that and why that would be and how that change in those collections is going to affect? Specifically, I'm thinking of like our February revenue forecasts.
Yeah. So you're speaking to with the SALT payments being brought forward with the income tax, I think specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you can get a better sense of that. I think when I look at that line on the left chart, the green line, so that's going to be this year to date. How much more sort of linear the trend there has become because of those payments being pushed forward, whereas in prior years it's linear up to a point, and then you get that big exponential bump there when all of those final payments come in, and so. From a perspective of sort of a statistical projection, it makes things less sort of variant throughout the year. And then also, I think I mentioned this maybe in my comments during the presentation, but just the fact that we're pulling forward some of that money, that there's less uncertainty because there's just less dollars that are going to be coming in April relative to prior years. Obviously that the actual dollar amount would depend on how much collections would be that year, but the proportion of it that'll be coming in April will be smaller going forward. And so when we're making those projections with the February forecast, that's going to have these payments embedded in them going forward. And we'll have year-over-year comps to look at next year. This was obviously the first year, so it was hard to kind of gauge how much we should read into that. But that's kind of the thought there.
Can I ask a follow-up also?
Yep.
And I'd love to hear from all three of you. What do you think are the biggest risks going forward in our forecast and our collections? I'm thinking of things like the Fed changing rates, bank credit tightening, and also the debt discussion. What are your biggest concerns right now?
Yeah, I'll since I was already talking, I guess I'll just lead it off. Those are all totally like top of mind type of things that I would think about as well. Obviously, the X factor of whether the debt ceiling gets raised or not is, we talked about it in the revenue snapshot this month. It's like this huge gray cloud, whether they do or don't. But in terms of, what can we look at as like an economic indicator? That's really just like a policy, a binary thing that, is up to the federal government to determine. But for what we look at, I would look at like employment, because that's really been like our big thing that's been holding this up through this. In spite of high interest rates and inflation, we've seen a really solid labor market, and so that's really helped to keep our revenue, and specifically with individual income tax where it is. So in terms of like what to look for, I would be looking at whether that's deteriorating or not as kind of my bellwether or the canary, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, if I may, Mr. Chair, I'll follow up on that. I do think the things you've identified, interest rate increases, as you look, I don't think the economy's fully absorbed existing interest rate increases, so I still think there are impacts. although certainly there have been significant effects, especially on housing markets. And so I think that's a real risk that's out there. I also look at inflation, and you see that headline inflation has dropped quite a bit, but the inflation measure that the Federal Reserve tracks has not dropped. As you know, headline inflation, consumer price index, has dropped in half. The core personal consumption expenditures index has not. It's just dropped a little bit. And so it'll be interesting to see how the Federal Reserve deals with that going forward. And the one thing, again, following up on the comment about labor markets, I think labor markets right now create so much uncertainty. These household balances sitting there, I think, create uncertainty. And I also think labor markets create a lot of uncertainty. We still have tight labor markets, very tight labor markets. And I don't think that's a cyclical thing, meaning I don't think that's necessarily only related to the pandemic or some short-term thing. A lot of it relates to structural changes in the composition of the workforce, and especially with baby boomers retiring. People have been talking about this day for 70 years. When baby boomers are going to retire, they're still consuming by and large, but they're not in the labor force in the same way. And my own view is that tight labor markets are the permanent norm moving forward. And that also creates uncertainty, right? Recessions tend to occur when you have all the layoffs, and then incomes drop, and then people stop buying other things, and you kind of get this negative cycle going. If somebody gets laid off and they can easily go find another job, it's kind of like a circuit breaker in that process. So that's something I think is a positive to the economy moving forward, but it's also balanced against all these risks that are out there. And my operating assumption is the federal government's going to work out some deal on the debt ceiling increase, and that'll move forward. But certainly that would be a catastrophic event if the federal government were to default on its debt.
What do you think?
They covered both of them, yes.
Well, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I have one last question. As it relates to a potential government shutdown, which, everybody wants to avoid, but it's happened before, it could happen again. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on what the immediate impact on Utah's economy could be from such a shutdown. I know that, I think it was in 2013 we established, I think we have the authority to access the sovereign lands management account, that we could keep the national parks open if that was to happen again. Are there any other items that would be worth noting that could immediately impact the state if this is to happen?
Maybe I'll jump in on that.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the shutdown, just because I was dealing with these issues the last time we had to confront that. There's kind of a federal shutdown that's a political thing that's not really actually shutting down the whole federal government, right? It's just like these little pieces of the federal government that shut down. So Social Security checks keep coming, Medicaid keeps being paid for, all of these big programs. I think if you had major impacts on those types of things, it would have a much larger economic effect than some of these small things. And obviously every situation is new, but we've kind of maybe worked through to some extent how to navigate some of these, like the national park issue that you bring up. So I think to some extent it depends on the definition of what a shutdown actually is. And a lot of times it tends to be things at the margins, not a wholesale actual shutdown of the federal government.
Okay, thank you. That's all the lights I have for now. We've got, yep.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Please.
Andrea Wilco with the Office of the Legislative Fiscal Analyst. I am here to be the voice of doom, basically, which is my role in life.
As usual, thank you. We welcome.
Basically, I'm just supposed to point out the takeaway from these charts you've seen from Travis and Bedusa is if you actually look at that 7-day rolling average one where we've gone from from final payments from positive to negative, what that probably means for revenue at the end of the year is that we will probably be short from our forecasts. Anywhere from probably 175 to 300 million. You've got buffers in place to take care of that. You've set aside, but as always, I am here to lower your expectations, and wanted to just get that on the record.
Duly noted.
Thank you. Sorry, see, aren't you just glad I made it back here just in time to?
Yes, thank you for
Be the
helping
voice
us
of doom?
understand what it could mean, though. But suffice it to say, those numbers are nowhere near what I'm hearing in the neighboring state of California of 33 billion, and that's actually just for the year they're working on
That's
right now, I
correct. We
believe.
can be grateful for small favors.
Yes, so, okay, all right. Thank you very much for the presentation. Okay, we'll move on to item number 5 now. Sales tax, remote sales transaction test. Invite Commissioner Rockwell to the witness stand there, one of our Utah State Tax Commissioners. And we will turn the time over to you to enlighten us on this issue.
Yes, thank you. I'm Commissioner Rebecca Rockwell with the Utah State Tax Commission, and after Andrea Wilco's final remarks, this is perfect timing to be bringing to you an option for a tax cut. But I will proceed with that anyway. After the passage of the United States Supreme Court's Wayfair decision, the majority of states enacted legislation to expand the requirement for sellers to have the obligation to collect and remit sales and use taxes, rather than employing a traditional physical presence test, as had been the state of the law before Wayfair. Wayfair changed the legal landscape to allow states to impose also an economic threshold that would require sellers to have collection and remittance duties, even if they did not otherwise have physical presence in the state. The majority of states enacted legislation allowing for economic nexus, and Utah adopted the fact pattern that was presented to the court in the Wayfair case. Utah provides that to have economic nexus, a seller has to meet one of 2 tests. The first is to have gross sales in the state totaling $100,000 or more. The second test is to conduct a total of 200 or more transactions in the state. And in determining these standards, we look at what happened in the prior year. So we're now, believe it or not, approaching 5 years since Wayfair was decided. And it's actually kind of hard to believe for me, having served 30 years in state government. I questioned whether we would ever see a decision that allowed for economic nexus. But here we are 5 years later, and this has given states some time to evaluate the success of our economic nexus standards. And the Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board has recently issued a letter urging states to remove the transactional test from their economic nexus standards. And several reasons were cited in that letter, for urging this repeal. The first is that the transaction standard is difficult for sellers to track and for states to administer. It results in sellers that have high volumes of sales, but low-priced products being required to collect and remit taxes, even though the tax is minimal. And I have been, kind of talking to people about this and use as an illustration, if somebody sells 219-cent widgets in the state, and if you're assuming that someone sells 219-cent widgets in the state, their sales tax liability, both state and local, assuming a 7.25% rate, would be about $2.76. So a person can have economic nexus in Utah with a $2.76 tax liability. And I think that that is, certainly one of the leading factors that's causing states to rethink economic nexus. In addition to that, sales and use tax burdens on sellers has been an issue that is of interest to Congress. And the GAO recently issued a report where they suggested that Congress consider getting involved in establishing nationwide parameters for remote sales. Now, keep in mind that sales and use taxes have typically been a matter of state sovereignty, and to the extent that states and sellers can work cooperatively to reduce burdens on sellers, I believe that this increases the likelihood that sales and use taxation will remain in the hands of the states. So because the issue of economic nexus remains a matter of nationwide attention, the commission decided to bring this issue before the committee so that you can make the policy decision of whether to make changes to the economic nexus threshold. We, at this point, don't see a reason to change the dollar threshold. In fact, we fit within the majority of states in using the $100,000 threshold, and this is also something that was affirmed by the Supreme Court in the Wayfair decision as being a safe harbor. But we do urge the committee to consider whether to repeal or amend the transactional threshold. Of course, we recognize this is a policy decision. We'll note that it will aid in the administration of taxes if it is repealed because of the difficulty of collecting a potentially very small amount of tax. But we also view this as a matter to be left to the committee's discretion. That concludes my presentation unless you have any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. We do have a few questions. Representative Thurston?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to make sure I understand then. So the one option would be is that we have no transactional threshold, only a dollar threshold, and that would collect about the same revenue, but it would make it easier for you to administer.
So, and I think really the benefit that the state would get is the benefit to sellers in that it's, you can have, we have situations where a seller has nexus in 25 different states, and they're having to keep track of and monitor 25 states' different tax laws. And as we talked about in the example, this could be over $2.76 in tax liability. So we really see the primary benefit as being a benefit to taxpayers and to businesses.
But in terms of the revenue impact?
But in terms of the revenue impact,
Relatively small.
we're looking at a range of between $3 to $8 million state and local combined impact. To put that into perspective, our overall prior year collections from remote sellers are ranging in the $500 to $750 million range. So it's a very small percentage of the whole of remote collections, but still remains in a $3 to $8 million range.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could I make a motion that we open a bill file to implement this recommendation?
Sorry, yes, you can make a motion.
I would like to, I move that we open a committee bill file to implement the recommendation of the Tax Commission.
Okay, would you like to speak to that?
Not really. Just, it seems
It's your
like,
choice.
it seems like good policy, and usually the commissioner doesn't bring us bad policy, so I'm very interested in making this happen.
Okay,
Usu-
discussion to
usually.
that motion. I don't think, see, Representative Judkins, was your light in relation to this motion? Oh, okay, well, it is now. Okay, great.
I just had a question that is kind of in relation, but, and I appreciate the suggestion and support the motion. I just had a question about the $100,000 or more, the gross sales. And you said that that seems to be what other states are doing. I mean, how did that come about? That seems, would it be beneficial to lower that a little bit to make up for this
So
$8 million?
I think the reason that the majority of states adopted that threshold is because that was the exact fact pattern that went before the United States Supreme Court in Wayfair. And so I think that states felt safe in adopting that threshold because it was clearly within the breadth of the Dormant Commerce Clause under the Wayfair case. And it looks like there are about 24 states that have adopted that $100,000 threshold. Of the states that rely only on a sales threshold and not also a transactional threshold, there are about a dozen states that have kept $100,000. Arizona has a $200,000 threshold. Alabama and Mississippi have $250,000. California, Tennessee, and Texas have $500,000 as the threshold. And if it helps to put this into perspective a little more, it looks like the $100,000 threshold is kind of more concentrated in the western states. So if we were to adopt a higher threshold, other than Arizona, we would be a little bit of an outlier in the western states if we go above that. Nobody has gone below that.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, further discussion to the motion. Representative Lyman.
Thank you. And yeah, I guess this is in relation to the motion, but also questions on this. So the transactional threshold that we're talking about, we're talking about doing away with the transactional threshold. Would that save the tax commission staff in terms of enforcement and compliance with that?
So that is something that is really a question for the administration side. So for Scott Smith, my feeling is that there would be some savings, but whether it would equate to one full-time employee, I couldn't say that it would. Again, we're looking at $3 to $8 million versus $500 to $750 million. So we would still be collecting the vast bulk of the revenues on remote sellers, and I would have to say that the likely cost savings to the commission would be small. I think that this is really something that should be looked at more in terms of the benefit it offers to sellers and issues of retaining state sovereignty.
We're going to ask Scott Smith for comment, if you wish.
Scott Smith, Executive Director of the Tax Commission. As far as processing of the returns, there really wouldn't be a savings. And as far as enforcement, since these are the smaller dollars, we really aren't going after these dollars. We're going, and so there would be no savings for us.
Okay. That kind of leads to my other question. If we do away with the transactional threshold, does that mean that those people are no longer required to remit sales tax at that? It's not just a...
Yes, unless they develop physical presence in the state or end up meeting the $100,000 economic threshold in some other way. So as long as their presence in Utah remains small and they're under $100,000, then they could sell as many 19-cent widgets as they want, as long as they don't hit that $100,000 threshold. Now, one thing that you might want to be aware of as you go into this is that Utah law does provide for the voluntary collection of sales and use taxes. So even if somebody doesn't meet the transactional threshold or the economic threshold, they can still choose to collect taxes in Utah if they want. And of course, we're not going to turn those folks away, but at the same time, they would not be required to collect.
Thank you, Chair. And just one more clarifying question on that transactional. Is that uniform across the other states? Do they have, like you were talking about the difference between $100,000 or $200,000, the transactional level, is that common that other states don't have the transactional threshold?
So an increasing number of states are starting to propose legislation to repeal the transactional threshold. And I think a key player in this whole process is going to be South Dakota, because South Dakota was the state that was involved in the Wayfair litigation. And South Dakota just recently passed legislation. I think it was signed into law in February of 23, where they repealed the transactional test. And I think that could serve as momentum for other states to follow suit, combined with the fact that national organizations like Streamlined Sales Tax are pushing for a repeal. I think that we could see other states take action.
Okay, well, great report, and I do support the motion.
Thank you, Senator Bramble.
Thank you, and Rebecca, thank you. We'll be meeting in South Dakota, Rapid City, next week, the Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board, and I want to point out a couple of things. Under Bellis Hess and then subsequently the Quill decision, which was out of North Dakota, the question of undue burden on interstate commerce was at the forefront, keeping in mind that that decision was decided on a mid-'80s, 1980s fact pattern, and was decided in the early 90s when you didn't have even robust Excel spreadsheets. You had Lotus 1, 2, 3 and whatever. Utah was on the ground floor of helping craft the legislation in South Dakota. It was crafted in anticipation of forcing a revisiting of Quill and revisiting of the underlying Bellis Hess. The idea of putting both a transactional and a dollar threshold, that was a two-pronged approach to addressing the underlying issue of undue burden. But we didn't have a roadmap. And both NCSL, the Streamlined Governing Board, Rebecca, the Commissioner Valentine, Scott, the entire Utah tax administration and policy, we had significant input into what was happening, laying the foundation. There were 3 or 4 states, Utah was one of them in the mix, that was looking at crafting legislation intended to overturn Quill. Now that we have a few years of experience with it, the issue of these small dollar amounts, keep in mind that Utah, among other states, we passed the facilitator legislation that says that if you have a facilitator, eBay, Amazon, it could be any one of a number of online facilitators. The facilitator is deemed to be the entity that has to hit that threshold. So that eliminates, ultimately, the number of small companies that have under $100,000 of revenue in Utah that aren't using some form of an online facilitator. That's becoming increasingly rare. So I support this. One of the things that we're trying to do now with the Streamlined Governing Board, and I serve on their executive committee, is there are members of Congress who are actively trying to work to overturn the Wayfair decision. These are led by Montana, New Hampshire, the states that don't have Oregon. Is it Oregon? Yeah, Oregon.
Oregon, yes.
The states that don't have a sales tax are trying to argue that we're imposing a tax on their citizens, and we object to that. We're not imposing a tax on their business citizens. We're saying if they want to take advantage of the Utah market, they have to meet minimum compliance. But this, in part, is somewhat of a trying to inoculate us against gaining any traction of overturning Wayfair based on undue burden. So I support it. Like I said, we'll be meeting next week in Rapid City, South Dakota, addressing it. But the other thing I'd like to mention is Commissioner Rockwell just demonstrated why she is worthy of us confirming her this afternoon to another term on the Tax Commission.
Okay, thank you for that insight. The motion before us is to open the committee bill file. Representative Thurston, do you
Chair.
want to sum?
I'll waive.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Oh, yep, Representative Provo,
sorry, thanks. I have a quick question, if I could,
please.
regarding the motion. Would it be reasonable to ask the tax commission to work with legislative fiscal analysts just to see at what threshold could we perhaps, if we eliminated the threshold proposed in the motion, but maybe lowered the threshold to 95,000 or 90,000 point, could we lower that threshold to eliminate any kind of fiscal note on that? I'm not saying that has to be a part of the motion. I'm just wondering if we could get that information. Since we did just hear from Dr. Wilco that other parts of revenue may be down dramatically, I'm just curious if we could get.
Thank you
If
for
it was
that.
an option?
Thank you for that question, which was not a substitute motion. I'm going to go back to Senator Bramble for comment on that particular policy idea.
I would oppose that, and I would, because when we established, we collectively, the Streamlined Sales Tax Board, the South Dakota Legislature, that $100,000 didn't just get chosen out of thin air. And if we reduce that, that plays directly into the theory of increasing a burden on out-of-state sellers, keeping in mind that these are very small, the small companies to begin with, and they're the ones that would most likely feel that burden rather than the big players that once they have their software set up, whether they have that threshold or not, they're going to voluntarily collect in all states because it's easier for them to do it consistently across their business model. So I would oppose reducing that $100,000 specifically because it plays into the argument of increasing the burden on business, which is the only angle that opponents of remote sales collection have to try to get back into court.
Did that answer your?
I would just clarify, yeah, and I would just, I'm not saying that should be done, just for argument's sake, I'm very fresh fees, just asking for, could report that out, I'm not saying it should be changed, I'm just curious. If it were to shift, where would that threshold be? But if that's too much work for the fiscal analyst and the commission, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Knowing how good the Tax Commission has been to work with, I'm sure if that's a personal question you'd like to ask them, that they could supply that, and then that could be something considered when we have a draft bill in front of us as a potential amendment. We're going to go to Representative Lyman.
Thanks, and I don't mean to belabor this. I really appreciate Senator Bramble's insight and background experience on this. I guess to Jen's, to JDP's
Representative
comment-
Provo.
Representative Provo, thank you. If this threshold was put in place a long time ago, rather than, I don't know if it's got any inflation adjustment aspect to it, but in essence, you're getting companies that would have been below the threshold then that are now up simply because of inflationary forces. So if anything, it would be a better discussion to see that rise rather than fall. So.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Place the motion then. All in favor of opening this committee bill, say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, chair rules that passes unanimously. Okay, I think, Commissioner, did you finish your presentation?
I sure did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for your time and insights. So, okay, we will move to item number 6 now on the agenda, mineral production tax withholding. Discuss issues related to mineral production tax withholding to establish consistency with income tax withholding and reporting requirements, and we welcome Commissioner John Valentine from the State Tax Commission to be with us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. John Valentine, Chairman of the Utah State Tax Commission. This is the end item agenda from the Tax Commission, and so I'm going to try to make this really simple and quick. The first thing that we're asking you to consider is to make the withholding rate the same for mineral production resource withholdings as we do for our income tax rates. Our corporate rate and our individual rates are exactly the same. However, the withholding requirement for mineral production accounts is 5%. That results in an over-withholding, and we're having to issue refunds, and people are in effect giving us interest-free loans for the time period that they've had that 5% withheld from their account, even though they're only paying 4.65% maximum rate. So that's the first thing. We're recommending that the legislature harmonize the mineral production withholding rate so that it always follows the tax rate in effect for that current year. Simple. Second thing we're asking is the other side of that coin, which is to harmonize the reporting requirements. Presently, we require that the mineral withholding production is administered with a number of reports that the withholder has to give that we don't do anything with. They're kind of useless. And so it's just an additional burden for that producer to file this report that we're not using. So we recommend that the legislature strike language in subsection 59.6.103.1C to allow the reporting requirements for withholding from mineral production to be the same as the withholding requirements on the income tax side. That's what we're asking for.
Wow, yet another taxpayer-friendly suggestion from the Tax Commission.
Can you
This is
believe that?
Kind of on a roll here, yeah. Okay, great. Representative Brammer.
Are we taking motions?
Yes, sure. Well, actually, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I don't recall the exact code section, but I would move in conformance with the request of the Tax Commission.
Okay, that is in order. Discussion to that motion, Senator McKay.
I was just going to suggest with so many taxpayer-friendly initiatives that they be given the Friend of the Taxpayer Award. That way they can share something in common with me, but not you.
Yeah, there's not a lot of friends of the taxpayer in this committee, so, all right. Oh, we have one, yeah, thank you, Representative Thurston, thanks for being a friend. And Representative Lyman, thank you. Okay, I'm cutting your microphone off. Okay, all right. I see no other discussion to that motion. Representative Brammer, would you like to sum?
And I like getting rid of that, so that sounds great. Thanks.
This is a rare exception where Representative Brammer's not bringing the hammer, so. All right, all in favor of opening up a committee bill file to bring mineral production tax withholding in compliance with our regular income tax withholding, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, chair rules that passes unanimously, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we'll get together with staff to give the specifics how to make that work.
Okay, thank you. And on behalf of the chairs, we'll just encourage you to continue to bring taxpayer-friendly ideas to our interim committees.
Usually those end up with reduction of revenue, so yes.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our agenda, unless there are any other items that would like to be brought up, which is actually item number 7. Okay, we do have some other item, Senator McKay.
Okay, so we, just in association with, just for transparency, we don't need a motion on any of these, but, we do have a list of things that we're actively working on from our study list, and just for the committee's purposes, I'll read off, some of the ideas that we're going to be working on, obviously, throughout our interim study list. We've talked about the remote sales transactions test. We've talked about the mineral production tax withholding. We've talked about this in previous. I was really surprised, honestly. We did our process so interesting. We're assigning committees. We studied things all last interim, and then the House had all new faces on rev and taxes last year, which was interesting because many of you were looking at it like, why would you guys ever do these things? And we're like, well, we studied them during the summer, so now you'll have the advantage of that. But one of the issues we have is at the Tax Commission was a Supreme Court decision in the Buck v. Utah State Tax Commission bill or case. Looking at the Finder program, the leadership has asked us to look at the definition of short-term rental as it is associated with when it qualifies or is required as part of the transient room taxes. Also looking at cigarette and tobacco taxes, and trying to figure out the right filings and the right work to go along with those tax policies. Some dealing with penalties and interests and refunds. This is an issue that's brought forward by the Tax Commission. The exclusive use property tax exemption is an issue we've looked at for the last 2 years, and still trying to find the right way to classify property that is held for religious and charitable or education purposes, and when it should be exempt from property tax. Looking at definitions within the circuit breaker tax as the circuit breaker and property tax as the Tax Commission has brought forward a couple of issues. Dealing with sunset extensions, I don't have much clarity on that, but those are two. Dealing with electronic cigarettes and other nicotine tax products. Let's see, dealing with centrally and locally assessed property taxes. Stabilizing property taxes through commercial and land sale price disclosure. Stabilizing property tax through looking at how the residential exemption is applied in the statute. Water district property tax rates, potential for a taxpayer bill of rights, along with potential resolutions to amend the Constitution related to taxes. And so, buckle up. It is going to be a busy, busy interim. So, yeah. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the time.
Okay, thank you. I see no further lights, so I will look for a final motion. Senator Bramble, motion to adjourn. All in favor say aye. Aye. That passes unanimously. We stand adjourned. Thank you.